Hi again. Let's finish off the trigeminal nerve with discussion of the mandibular branch, the third branch. So, as I put on the slide, make sure that you read the textbook. The section for the trigeminal and the facial that's expanded at the end of the chapter is worth reading. Again, don't get hung up on the anatomical description for the pathways of some of these nerves. They get rather detailed and down into the weeds, and I think we can avoid much of that. But I do want you to read about the function of the nerves and the branches. So, the mandibular branch is divided into two roots, a smaller motor root and a larger sensory root. The textbook also discusses the nerve in terms of an anterior division and a posterior division. Different ways of sort of grouping the branches of the nerve. I'm focusing more on motor and sensory. So the smaller motor root of the trigeminal is to all of the muscles of mastication, as we've already done. You already knew this. We've already dealt with that. You wrote an essay on it. You did a good job. Don't forget that those fibers come from the mandibular branch. The motor branch also innervates the myelohyoid and the anterior belly of the digastric, but we will come to that a little bit later. So, those are the branches of the motor root. We'll take a look at some figures in a moment. The larger sensory root, the auriculotemporal, so around the ear and scalp, behind the ear, temporal region. So remember what we're dealing with here are the dermatomes with this sensory for the most part. So this is the skin of the mandibular region. So review those pictures. Okay. Here's one that you really need to pay attention to is the buccal nerve. It's for sensory only. So don't confuse the buccal nerve here with the trigeminal with a branch of the facial nerve. I'll go over this again in another slide. But the Buccinator muscle is innervated by the facial nerve. The buccinator is one of the muscles of facial expression. So when we're talking about a buccal nerve here, we're not talking about somatic motor. It's for sensory. We'll go through that. And then we have the lingual nerve. This is for sensory only, touch, pressure, and the lingual gingiva. The lingual nerve does not carry sensory fibers for taste. It's sensory for touch and pressure for the body of the tongue. And then we also have the inferior alveolar, which is sensory for all of the mandibular teeth. Okay. So a quick picture for the muscles of mastication, and I put a note in here that you shouldn't have any trouble with. Name the muscle and the action for this one, and I might include to here, just so you don't forget, but review the origin and insertion of each muscle. You've already done that, just don't forget about them. So here are the four muscles of mastication, four sets in red. And this, of course, is the Buccinator muscle. And this is where the illustration is a little bit confusing if you don't read the text. So here is the Buccal Nerve. This is part of V3. and it looks like it's running right out onto the buccinator muscle, which it is, but it is not innervating it. It is not causing the buccinator to contract. This is sensory only. The sensory nerve runs out onto the surface of the buccinator and also is carrying fibers from the buccal gingiva, the cheek, that region. So it's sensory, not motor. So maybe I'll put a little note here. This is sensory, not motor. Even though it sort of looks like it if you're not paying attention and not reading the book. Because all of the other nerves that we're looking at here run out onto these muscles of mastication, and here comes another one out onto the buccinator. So if you're not careful, it sort of looks like it's somatic motor, which it is not. It's sensory. Okay, moving on. Again, read the text. And here's a note again on the buccal nerve. It's sensory for skin of the cheek, buccal mucosa, gingiva, for the postmandibular teeth. And again, I keep emphasizing this, it is sensory only. Okay? And here's the note on motor. Somatic motor to the buccinator muscle is from the facial nerve. It's one of the muscles of facial expression. So notes again on the auriculotemporal, external ear, temporal scalp. The lingual nerve, this is for sensory. General sensation for the body of the tongue, not taste. So it's sensory for the floor of the mouth, lingual gingiva, and all of the gingiva of the mandibular teeth. The lingual nerve runs along the side of the tongue. And there are pictures where I'll ask you to identify that. So the last one on this slide, the inferior alveolar nerve, the IA nerve, for sensory for all of the mandibular teeth. The incisive nerve, which is a branch of it, for the anterior teeth and the mandibular premolars. And the mental nerve branches from this for the chin, lower lip, labial mucosa, mandibular premolars, and anterior teeth. So that region of the mucosa. Okay, so the next slide are nerves, and you should be able to identify these if I took the labels off. The opening, of course, is the trigeminal mandibular branch is passing through is the foramen ovale, so you should recognize that. And the auriculotemporal, again, sensory, behind the ear, and the lingual nerve is this large branch. Does not enter the mandible. The inferior alveolar nerve does enter the mandible at that mandibular foramen and travels through the mandibular canal of the mandible as the IA nerve and is carrying sensory fibers for all of the mandibular teeth. And then there's a branch of the IA nerve that passes through the mental foramen and is carrying sensory fibers for the surface of the lower jaw, the skin. And then the incisive nerve runs more or less, it branches also at the same point, and then the incisive nerve carries fibers, sensory fibers from the anterior teeth. So if I gave you a picture and I put a question mark on this to identify that nerve, that would be pretty easy. that would be the IA nerve. If I put a dot over here and asked you to identify that, that would also, that would be the IA nerve as well. Thought I had the lingual mark for a moment. Okay? We will come back and talk about the chorda tympani when we talk about the facial nerve. So, part of 7, the chorda tympani. Shows the Myelohyoid Nerve, the branch, which leaves the IA nerve here. It's hard to see in this figure, but that's the Myelohyoid Nerve. It does not enter the mandibular canal. It's running down to the Myelohyoid muscle. So let's move on. So get yourself oriented, medial view, and we have the lingual nerve. Draw a yellow dot on it. And we have the IA nerve and the Myelohyoid nerve. So again, here is the IA nerve entering the mandibular foramen. The branch coming off is the Myelohyoid nerve, and it's running down onto the Myelohyoid muscle. So I think we've gone over most of this. The bullet points at the top. Myelohyoid nerve going to the myelohyoid and the anterior belly of the digastric. They're in the same spot. Something to maybe pay attention to. Here is the submandibular ganglion. And you know what that's all about. That's where the pre and post ganglionic fibers synapse for the facial nerve that are going to supply the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands. Now when you read the text and you read the description of the lingual nerve, the way the text reads is that the lingual nerve communicates with the submandibular ganglion, which is right here. Well, anatomically, when we're talking about communication between two structures, we just mean that they're associated. They contact each other, but the lingual nerve is not carrying any fibers to or from that ganglion. We'll look at those. Well, actually, I should not jump ahead. What we're going to have to come back to when we talk about the ganglion is this chorda tympani up here. I'm drawing in yellow. And what it does, I'll sort of a spoiler alert, is that this is part of the facial nerve. The chorda tympani. And it's running over the tympanum, how it gets its name. So I'm up in the eardrum with the marker, drawing a yellow line right across the eardrum, comes over here and it merges with the facial nerve. And those fibers then do this sort of a loop-de-loop thing. So the chorda tympani is part of the facial, and what is sometimes tricky is that it's running with the lingual nerve. And it comes down with the lingual nerve, and it goes, so I jumped over that yellow dot, and then it runs into the submandibular ganglion. And then you have a synapse in the ganglion, which then goes back off to the salivary glands. So jumping ahead a little bit with the chorda tympani when we do the facial nerve. So it's not part of V3. But the lingual nerve carries those preganglionic fibers of 7. But if I asked you to identify, hold on a second, let me get an eraser in here. Let's get rid of that little dot. The point is, if I asked you to identify this nerve that I'm going to circle in green, if I asked you to identify that nerve, you would not call it the chorda tympani, you would call it the lingual nerve. Okay? More on that later. Oh, that was it. Make sure I covered what I wanted to. Yeah, so not a lot to it. Review those branches, review the objective sheet, and be sure to read the textbook. It will describe the function of the nerves rather well. So, goodbye for now, and we'll do our last lecture on the nervous system with the facial nerve. Bye.